Mr. Begley and members of the board, we do have 2 items for board discussion this evening. The first item is a book study discussion. And this evening, we will be looking at chapters 1 through 3, pages 1 through 89 of our book, Solve Employee Problems Before They Start by Scott Warwick. Just to get us started, before I turn it over to Mr. Begley, prompts to facilitate discussion. I read, I noticed, I wondered.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. I'll open it to comments. What do we think?
I like what I've read so far. It's very interesting. I knew we weren't technically assigned the introduction, but I read the introduction anyway, and he caught my attention right away, and I'm trying to, I highlighted it. But there was a quote where he said, really, really smart people often tend to do really dumb things. And I don't know about really, really smart. I consider myself a fairly smart person, but I do and say some dumb things sometimes, especially when I have a camera on me. So, that caught my attention. I was like, oh yeah, I'm really going to like this. So, and it has not disappointed so far.
I agree. Thank you.
I agree. We were talking right before this meeting that it was really hard to pinpoint a part in this section we read, because honestly the whole section made me reflect a lot about how I emotionally deal with a lot of situations and problem solve and stuff like that. One of the important things for me on page 70 is possible strategies for improvement. And I can tell you, for me specifically, soundboarding, finding somebody to talk to and telling them about how I'm feeling and then them giving me feedback on that is super key to me.
Yeah. He talked about that. He talked about being strong enough to work through some of these issues, to accept the criticism and to grow, to be better at the things that quite honestly, it seemed like most people just don't notice, right? They're not very self-aware.
Yeah, not letting your ego overshadow your emotion to be able to move through things.
It really touched a nerve with me too. I've often thought, doesn't that person see how they're acting or what they're saying, or where's the self-awareness? But I think the way he explained it is we value our strengths and don't spend much time on our weaknesses. Mm-hmm. So a lot of this just makes perfect sense. You have done a book report plus. What would you like to say?
Oh, goodness. Yeah, I enjoyed the reading so far.
I couldn't tell.
I'm sorry. Yeah, that's, yeah, okay. I thought it was really good. One of the things that really struck me, it was this saying, and it's right in the introduction leading up into the actual chapter 1. So it says, education may get you in the door, but emotional intelligence keeps you in the door and moves you up the ladder. And I thought that was really, really important. And it was a good way to start within the introduction as he moves into one of his first stories where he's talking about how this shows up with people. So the story of Robert Oppenheimer versus Langen. Langen was the smart, he's, I guess, still noted as the smartest person in the world. Had an IQ of 210. It was really off the chart. Whereas Oppenheimer, I think, was 156 or something like that, compared to Einstein, who was 150, to put it in perspective. But, Oppenheimer went on to be one of the fathers of physics and creating the atomic bomb. It revolutionized war. But he, along the way, he actually tried to poison his teacher at Cambridge. And he talked his way out of that. And they make this comparison to Langen because Langen, who was the smartest man, I guess, known, did not finish college. Didn't finish college and just could not pursue his dreams, and he wound up doing something totally off from where he was. But the author talks about how that emotional intelligence that Oppenheimer had probably helped him get out of a situation that should have derailed his entire career, whereas Langan, because he had grown up in such a challenging environment where he'd had to rely so much on that fight or flight instinct and had developed that muscle for a fight, he carried that throughout his life. And so in carrying that through, it showed up in so many ways because he could not adequately use emotional intelligence to basically work things out for himself, to get some advantages. So the smartest man in the world was derailed by not having enough emotional intelligence. And I thought throughout the book, there were just so many stories, so many examples that were powerful. And this verbal JEAT, the EPR, which is what is that, listening versus, what was that? Yes, parroting and rewards. I thought that he used those in excellent ways and really pointed out some things that many of us do. I can see myself in some of this, but I think for kids, just remember, IQ is great and you'll maintain that through your adult life, but your emotional intelligence continues to expand throughout your life.
Right, yeah. That was the other point, is your IQ is kind of your IQ through adulthood, but you could certainly grow your emotional intelligence.
That's right.
That's a great
That's
point.
right.
Technical skills, academic credentials, all those things are really important to start a career, but to really advance, you have to be able to play nicely with others.
That's right.
To a certain degree, that's what he's saying, right? But
Mhm.
it goes into a lot more detail as to what that really means. And I think it's so true. In my personal career, and I think this probably is consistent in most industries, if you show competency in your job, you then advance into management. Well, what skills do you have to manage other people, right? So competency in underwriting is a long way from competency in managing people, dealing with people. So I'm sure that trips up people along the way all the time. And near the end of our reading section, he gave a number of really good examples, kind of case studies, where he was giving them an emotional assessment, emotional IQ. And one that stuck with me was the story of Ed, who just couldn't figure it out, didn't want to hear what they had to say.
Yeah.
And his statement to him was, everywhere you go, you take yourself with you, right? So whether it's this job or the next job, Ed, if you don't figure it out, it's not going to be any better.
It's not going to be any better. Yeah.
Anyone else?
I really like the part way back in chapter 1 here, page 9, where he says, real trust is built through conflict, not through agreement. And that got me thinking. I stopped and reflected for a few minutes that some of the people that I have been closest to in my life, I have had some serious, disagreements, we're talking religious, political, whatever, disagreements with, but we always felt like we could talk to each other about it. And some things we kind of just agreed to disagree on. Other things we would still come back and kind of verbally go spar about it. But we knew we could trust each other with our thoughts, each other's thoughts, and that disagreement, and, we weren't going to be attacked for it. So that really stuck out to me.
It makes me think of later on in that chapter, he talks about figures, trying to give people a representation of a good model. He brings up Abraham Lincoln and how Abraham Lincoln made his entire cabinet people that basically opposed everything he stood for because he knew that was the best way to make compromises and better our nation.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I think on page 50, it's under the section, having a high IQ is not enough. And he goes into basically these 3 main areas of intellectual development that's important for attaining one's goals. He identified the first as abstract intelligence, which is the ability to process and understand different concepts. The mechanical intelligence, which was the second, which was the ability to handle physical objects. And then the third one was that social intelligence, which is the ability to handle human interaction. And so I thought, that's consistent throughout time. We've seen that back in the past, we see it now. So I thought those were really, really good things to point out. And it really does make sense, as far as that emotional quotient that he is constantly talking about throughout the book. It's measurable, and based on these types of criteria that we see developed throughout the framework of the book, you can gauge where you are, and you can, make some changes based on it. So I think this is really good. I can understand that it's a great book for HR. I think it's a great book for anyone, anyone to read.
Self-help.
It's a nice self-help book. I mean, the language is a little rough in some places, and he's a little brutal. Boy, he really doesn't like Simon Cowell.
No, he does not.
He does not like Simon Cowell. But he does give you all of these great examples of how the amygdala versus using that frontal lobe can come in to help, and just how technically all of that works, and how you have to basically get past this brain that really hasn't developed for, what is it, how many, like 5,000 years. And that just taking a step back, breathing, just letting yourself have a second before you react when you're in a stressful period is good. So, and I'm enjoying the books so far. And I just wanted to point those little things out. I'll stop it.
We can't do them all.
Can't do them all.
Yeah.
But there were lots of good books.
Yeah,
I can't do them all.
absolutely. Anyone else want to share anything?
Me again. I enjoyed the part where he's talking about go-to people. Like, when, a lot of parts of these, when he was talking about them, could see it in myself, I could see it in other people I knew. When he was talking about go-to people, I remembered this firm I worked at while I was in law school, and we were very collaborative. We'd often talk about cases that we had, or questions, issues we had with cases. And, you put a bunch of attorneys and paralegals in a room, and it can get animated sometimes. It can get passionate. And John's looking away. But they have these animated conversations back and forth or whatever. And there was one attorney, he was an older gentleman, and he would just kind of sit there like this. And sometimes he'd close his eyes, and he'd just be listening to everybody's thoughts and whatnot. And then finally, when it would quiet down, he'd say, well, let me tell you what I think. And everybody stopped. And whatever he'd say was like, oh my gosh, why didn't we think of that, or whatever. And he was like our go-to. Anytime anybody had a question or a tough case, they knew they could go into his office, and he was the go-to person. But he didn't have that emotional, strong reaction like, this is exactly how we have to handle this, or whatever. He would just sit back and just take it in, think about it, and go, okay, here's what we need to do. So, yeah, I really like that part too, because it made me think of him.
I mean, one of the things you can do that's fun, you can kind of compare some of the leaders of today, and you can kind of sort of think, does this guy have a high? So I don't know. I'm thinking about Elon Musk and his purchase of Twitter, and thinking, I don't know, buying that in the midst of being being in that type of emotional state may have been an example of not making good decisions. But that's just one of the fun parts of it. That was mean. But he's mean in here too, so. He's very honest.
Anyone else want to share?
You want to share? I had 3 things, and one was the piece about being a go-to person. So I will not repeat that on page 15. I thought that was interesting. The other one is on page 45, and I think we've had this discussion in one of our other books. It talks about When we stop and think for a minute, what we lose in speed, we gain in the accuracy of the frontal lobes or the high road. The ability to slow down and think allows our frontal lobes to take control of your emotional brain and many of the subconscious thoughts that live there. That is why the difference between success and failure and the difference between being happy and being miserable is 5 seconds. Slowing down and thinking for just 5 seconds allows your frontal lobes to better control your emotional system. And that's something that we talked about in both a couple years ago, and I have worked really hard, and I think I'm pretty good at it, but every once in a while I react quickly. And every single time I wish that I would not have done that I would have just pressed pause and just waited 5 seconds. That's really all it takes to catch your breath, process, and sometimes maybe even longer than 5 seconds. You know, and you can, you know, there's some strategies there in those conversations, you know, to even if you're not ready after 5 seconds, you can say to the other person, well, so can you say that again? I just want to make sure I have a clear understanding of what happened, and, you know, before I speak, you know, and I buy yourself some more time. So I appreciated that. Last one on page 73. This falls under possible strategies for improvement. There were 3. And again, one is before you react emotionally, stop and think. Focus on solutions rather than adopting a woe is me mentality. It's easy to fall into that second one. 3, stay away from problem people who infest your lives. They transmit their negative emotions to you and drag you down with them. And I think all of us are surrounded by people who would like to do that. And it's easy to allow that and to fall into that. And so I think those are great pieces of advice.
And recognizing the ants from that same page, those automatic negative prompts.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
In 83, it talks about customer service is nothing more than employee relations turned outward, right? So it makes that comparison. And another point, I'm not sure what page you talked about, you know, you'd never beat on an $8,000 copy machine, but you beat up your $50,000 employee, right? And
Yep.
what is that, right?
Right.
Great point. Well, I think it's a great read. We'll revisit this in February.
Yes, we will.
3 more chapters.
Yep, in February, Board of Education, February 16, chapters 4 through 6, pages 91 through 143, and my personal opinion is it only gets better.
Good.
So I think you'll enjoy it.
Great, thank you.
All right, up next, next item for board discussion, memorandum of understanding with OPSI Local 378. I'll turn it over to Mrs. Howard.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Mr. Begley and members of the board, I just wanted to make you aware of an MOU that we have proposed for you this evening with the OPSI Local 378. This MOU will change the number of hours worked for 5 of our educational assistants at the high school from 6.5 hours to 7 hours. The reason that we are proposing this MOU and this additional time is needed to ensure the busing needs of some of our special education students here at the high school. So it's for their safety and well-being and making sure that they are watched over and safely transported safely getting to the buses and getting transported home. Pending your approval, this additional time added to the workday of these 5 employees would be effective starting tomorrow, but would only be for the remainder of this school year only. Just wanted to give you a chance to ask any questions about that, as it is an item for board action this evening.
Questions, concerns?
So my question is what's the plan going forward after 2023? Are we going to reevaluate and see if they need to permanently be at 7 hours?
Correct.
Okay.
And moving forward for the remainder of this year, all parties are in agreement. These 5 employees understand they're happy and willing to take on this additional time to ensure that our students' needs are met. questions?
No, I don't.
Okay.